And certainly want to welcome those who might be connected with us here today on the webcast. A little gloomy day out there today, but nice and cheery inside here with all of you. Well, here we are observing the first Sabbath of the year 2024. That's by the Gregorian calendar that our society uses this day. Now, we've all seen this past week, I think, probably some of the traditional events and celebrations that occur around the world at this particular time of year. All the fireworks, the parties, the revelries of various types, and certainly of various scales as well. There's the usual recognition of key events that occurred over the past year, and then there's, of course, the endless stories of the New Year's resolutions that are made, but also very soon forgotten. Those, of course, are short-term or short-lived goals or commitments that people made, commitments they made to change their lives and try to do things that would make improvements in the year ahead. Now, we can't say, or we don't dare say, that not everyone follows through on those commitments, but as a rule, in general, most often we can look and see that things always continue on as they've always been. Our focus, of course, as part of God's church, hopefully, is a bit different. Our commitment to change and to grow isn't centered on a calendar year, one calendar year in the day. Our goal, of course, is every day, to remain steadfast in living God's way of life and striving to grow in spiritual character. It is indeed a challenging task as we live in a world that is withdrawing farther and farther away from God, a corrupt world that is becoming more violent and certainly more dangerous as we get closer to the end of this age. Now, there's many admonitions in the Bible telling us, of course, to take heed of the things that are going on around us, things that we are to keep in mind, and we're to take heed so that we can stay on course as we strive to grow toward God's kingdom. There's also, of course, many words of encouragement found in the Scriptures that remind us of the power that is available to us as God's children. The theme for the Winter Family Weekend this year, Be Strong and of Good Courage, is one of those reminders that tells us that God is always there with us in every situation. But we, of course, have our part to do in becoming strong, putting on the faith, or putting faith in our faith and our trust in God the Father and, of course, His Son, Jesus Christ. It's important, of course, that we're reminded of these things because the challenges that are yet ahead for us are going to be greater than anything mankind has ever faced before. Now, the admonitions and the encouragements that we find in the Bible are often illustrated using metaphors. A metaphor uses something as a representative of or symbolic of something else. One kind of object or an idea in place of another that illustrates a likeness between the two. Christ, of course, spoke in parables that often used metaphors. His metaphors kept the majority of his audience from understanding the true message that he was presenting. The parable of the sower is one example of that. In that parable, Christ used a description of terms that were very familiar to the people of that day and age, but the true spiritual meaning of what he was saying was lost for the most part on his audience. Well, today we have the benefit, of course, of minds that have been opened to understand the deeper spiritual meaning of that message that Christ was giving. There's a metaphor that is found throughout the Bible that is used in a number of different ways. It revolves around a simple item, a well-known item to man, well-known to mankind from the very earliest of time. That item was the yoke, Y-O-K-E. The yoke was a wooden device used, of course, by centuries to harness the power of draft animals, to harness them together for doing work. And it is still used in the simplest form in various parts of the world even today. A wooden bar placed across the shoulders of a man with hooks on the ends of that wooden bar for carrying buckets facilitate a man to carry heavy loads. And that's actually a type of yoke. A yoke, of course, in its most common form and in its most common usage in the Scriptures, was used to harness two oxen together, harnessing them together to pull heavy loads. An ox itself can actually pull its own weight, which is usually between 1,500 to 3,000 pounds. But a well-trained team of oxen yoked together can pull up to 12,000 pounds. So we see how this simple tool works a great benefit and allows a lot more work to be done. Now there's many references in the Bible where the yoke is used as a symbol of bondage, of slavery, and of servitude, but is often used in a prophetic sense as well. And we find in the Old Testament that God at times announced that he would place a yoke of bondage on his people because of their disobedience. In other places, God delivered his people by breaking the yoke of enslavement that was upon them. For the sermonette here this afternoon, we're going to look at two different ways the metaphor of the yoke directly relates to us in our lives today. And the title for the sermonette is Yoke Fellows with Christ. Yoke Fellows with Christ. Now, the first way that the yoke can be applied to us is in the form of an admonition or a warning. So let's turn, please, if you would, to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, we're going to begin here in verse 14. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Just the first sentence there in that verse. It says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers." Now we could tie that statement back to Deuteronomy 22, verse 10, where Moses was giving some miscellaneous laws to the Israelites. He said, "You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together." They were not to yoke two dissimilar animals together. In this case, the ox and the donkey. They were fundamentally incompatible in size and in physical characteristics, and they were never meant to be brought together in that fashion. They can't work together in harmony. For the health and the well-being of the animals, they should not be forced to work together in that type of arrangement or with that kind of a union. Well, continuing here in verse 14, 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14, it says, For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial, or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. So we're not to be yoked to dissimilar or individuals that are not like us. We notice in those verses there that followed, that we just read there, the distinct contrast that was made between light and darkness, belief and unbelief, and so forth. Point made, of course, is that this is a spiritual matter, and there's certain situations that we are to be very, very careful to avoid. We grow, of course, over time to discern, to be able to distinguish the difference, and then we are to make sure that we remain separate from those situations. This, of course, was a warning that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, but he wrote this to all Christians as well, that we are to be careful not to be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. We're not to enter in this type of bond or this type of an association with those who do not believe like we do. This is a very strong warning, and is often used in the aspect of not entering into a marriage with someone who does not have the same beliefs as we do. We're not to enter into business partnerships with someone of a different belief system that could eventually cause us a big problem. Any type of a relationship that someone else could then influence us or lead us away from our relationship with God. Now, that doesn't mean that we're to totally disassociate with everyone who doesn't know and doesn't understand God's truth. We still have to live in this world. We're to live in this world but not be of it, in terms, of course, of the standards that are set for this world by the God of this world. We are to associate with, of course, our fellow employees, our neighbors, our relatives and friends, who may not be part of the church, but we're to associate with them and to set an example for them and to be a help and an encouragement to them. We're just not to be yoked together with them in certain ways. In that particular relationship that can pull us away from God's way of life and cause us to be separate from Him. Those whom God has called later in life that are already unequally yoked must at times go through a very painful process of severing those connections that they have. The encouraging factor is that God is there for them to help them in that process as well. Now, the second way that yoke can be applied to us comes in the form of an encouragement, or actually a promise. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11, and we're going to look at verses 28 through 30. Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. Here it says, Jesus Christ's words, He says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Well, here Jesus Christ tells us to take His yoke upon us, to willingly enter into this type of relationship with Him. He freely offers it to us, but we have to be willing. We have to be willing to yield ourselves, to put ourselves under that yoke. His yoke provides us priceless benefits and comforts. And part of Christ's message here is to those who are burdened or were burdened by the oppressive Jewish practices of that day that they lived under. They were to come out from under that and not be subject to it any longer. God's way is not a heavy burden. As a reference, Galatians 5 and verse 1, Galatians 5 verse 1, it says, "Do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage." He's referring to those Jewish regulations which were such a burden upon the people of that time and day. William Barclay, in his New Daily Study Bible, makes some interesting observations about these verses here in Matthew 11. I'd just like to quote from his comments on those verses. Mr. Barclay writes, he says, "Christ said, 'My yoke is easy.' The word easy in Greek means well-fitting. In Palestine, ox yokes were made of wood. The ox was brought, and the measurements were taken. The yoke was then roughed out, and the ox was brought back to have the yoke tried on. The yoke was carefully adjusted so that it would fit well and not chafe the neck of the patient animal. The yoke was tailor-made to fit the ox." It's kind of like buying a suit today, isn't it? You know, they brought this ox in, and these yokes were made specifically to fit them. He continues, he says, "There is a legend that Jesus made the best ox yokes in all of Galilee, and that from all over the country, people came to Him to buy the best yokes that skill can make." Jesus Christ says, He says, "My yoke fits well. The life I give you is not a burden to cause you pain. Your task is made to measure, to fit you. Whatever God sends us is made to fit our needs and our abilities exactly." That's the end then of what Mr. Barclay wrote. So we see then that a yoke is indeed a tool. Now, a tool can be used correctly or it can be used incorrectly. When used correctly, a yoke is intended to produce work, but it makes the work easier. It makes it much easier. Two yoked together can do more work than one. And so we see a great and tremendous benefit of our being yoked together with Jesus Christ. I'd like to read here another little article I found online that kind of illustrates this point. This comes from an article that was posted on June 4th in 2017. It's entitled "Yoked." It was written by Teresa Hislop. It can be found on the website lifeisthestoriesyoucantell.com. A long name there. But the article says this. It says, "In the physical work, yokes are tools. A tool does not eliminate work, but it certainly makes work easier. As a tool, yokes make work easier. Two oxen yoked together can do work that a single ox could not do. And when we're yoked with Christ, we work with him and accomplish things impossible on our own. Our part in the harness is to be faithful and obey. His share is to effect the atonement and to show us the way home. That's Christ's share. Following the analogy of oxen laboring together in a harness, Christ is like the older, wiser ox, carrying most of the burden while teaching and molding the younger ox, or us. And still following the analogy, as the younger ox works with the wiser ox, he becomes more like him, just as we become more like Christ by doing his work. Make no mistake, it is still work. The life of a Christian requires work and endurance. Pain and suffering are not eliminated. The yoke, as a tool, does not eliminate the work, but it does make the load light. The load is lighter, both because Christ shoulders the greater burden and because as we work with him, we become more like him and more capable of doing his work. And that's the end of the article. Jesus Christ's promise to us is that he invites us to participate. He invites us to participate and to share the load under his yoke with him. He pulls the heavy burden. Jesus Christ pulls the heavy burden while we grow to become more like him in every way. Notice that in both of the metaphors that we've looked at, a metaphor of admonishment and another metaphor of encouragement, we see this concept of being properly connected with one another, to be correctly connected with those of like mind. In our case, connected with Jesus Christ to pull together and to work together. It's a great message for us to think about, a great encouragement, and it's a great strength for us to think about as we face the challenges that we encounter each and every day of our lives. Christ calls us to labor together to work with him. Now, the title I gave this message, Yoke Fellows with Christ. It comes from Philippians 4, verse 3, in the King James Version. There, Paul calls those that are united with him in the work of proclaiming the gospel, he calls them yoke fellows, fellow workers. Fellow workers. Yoke fellows was a common word that was used by Greek writers referring to those united by close bonds. And so Paul calls those who are working with him, he calls them yoke fellows or fellow workers. What a blessing it is for us to be called to have a part, for us to be called today to have a part in the greatest work of all time.